Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you love powerful and forgotten stories from America's past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss when we bring history back to life. Now, let us begin. The haunting tale known as the daughter who became a wife, a family's darkest secret dot in the quiet corners of old America, where dusty roads bent around weathered barns and clapboard houses stood with tired dignity. Secrets often live longer than the people who kept them. Families, especially in the rural South and Midwest, carry burdens the outside world rarely saw. Behind lace curtains and candlelit windows, what looked like a life of ordinary struggle could sometimes hide. A story so dark that even the graveyard whispers dared not speak it. This is one such story, one that drifts between truth and memory, between hushed recollections and the faded ink of county records. It is the story of a family whose bond crossed a forbidden line, a father's weakness, a daughter's silence, and a household shaped by sin. The tale has been remembered not in history books, but in the cracks of old oral tradition passed, quietly, uneasily, by those who claim to have known someone who lived too close to it. They called her Anna, though some say her name was Sarah, or Mary, or another plain name fit for the century. But Anna is how her shadow survived. Anna was born around 1848 in a small settlement in Kentucky. Her family was poor, like most around them, scraping by on a thin patch of land that gave more stones than corn. Her father, Thomas, had once been a respectable veteran of the Mexican-American War, strong, with a stubborn jaw, and the sort of pride common to men who believed they had fought for something larger than themselves. But the war left more scars than medals, and back home, he turned to whiskey as if it were medicine. Her mother, Martha, carried the weight of the family. She stitched clothes, tended a garden, and gave birth to 6 children, though only 3 lived past infancy. The air of grief never quite left her eyes. Yet for all her suffering, she kept the household together. For Anna, her mother was the anchor, the steadying hand, the reason the home still felt like a place of refuge. But fate can be cruel. In 1859, sickness swept through the valley. It started with a fever, then coughing that rattled the ribs until the body gave out. By the time autumn came, Martha was gone lowered into the ground while the church bell tolled over the brown hills. Anna was 11 then, old enough to feel the hollowing loss but too young to fully grasp how it would change the course of her life. Thomas fell apart after his wife's death. He wandered between his fields and the local tavern, speaking less, drinking more. The children, left half-orphaned, leaned on Anna. She grew quickly in those years, not just in body, but in spirit. She cooked, cleaned, soothed her younger siblings when storms rattled the house. Neighbors often remarked how she seemed older than her years, with a calmness that belied her age. But beneath that strength was a girl still aching for her mother, still desperate for safety. By the time Anna reached 15, she was the only daughter left at home. Her brothers drifted off, one to work in the coal pits, another to the Union Army when the Civil War thundered across the land. Alone with her father, Anna became both daughter and mother in that house. She mended his shirts, cooked his meals, and listened to his rambling tales when the whiskey blurred his tongue. And then, the whispers say, something shifted. Old court records and family stories never align perfectly. Some claim Thomas was lost in his grief, unable to separate the image of his dead wife from the daughter who so resembled her. Others argue it was the isolation of war-torn Kentucky, where the rules of society felt far away, where survival twisted love into something darker. Whatever the reason, by the winter of 1864, Anna was no longer seen simply as his daughter. She was spoken of never aloud, but in muttered tones as his companion. It began with small changes. He no longer introduced her, as my daughter Anna when neighbors came by. Instead, he'd simply say Anna, letting the word hang with a weight people noticed. He grew protective of her, possessive even, his hand lingering on her shoulder. Too long, his eyes watching too closely when other men rode past. At church, they sat together not as father and daughter, but as man and woman. The congregation shifted in their pews, uneasy, but no one dared confront him. He was, after all, a veteran, a man known for his temper. Anna herself became withdrawn. Once a lively girl who sang while she worked, she grew quiet, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands busy with endless tasks. Some said she looked trapped, like a bird in a cage. Others swore she seemed resigned, carrying herself with the air of someone who had accepted her fate. In the summer of 1865, when the war ended and soldiers returned home, people noticed Anna wore a plain band of metal around her finger. It wasn't the golden ring of a bride, but it was enough to spark rumors. Her father never explained it. Anna never spoke of it. But the valley began to murmur. The father had taken his daughter as his wife. There was no formal wedding, no preachers. Blessing, no paper signed. It was a bond formed in shadows, held by fear and silence. And yet, in that house on the edge of the Kentucky hills, Anna's life had changed forever. The cruelest part of the story is not just the sin itself, but the way the world looked away. Neighbors whispered, but did nothing. The church avoided the matter, claiming it was not theirs to judge. In a time when families were fractured by war and survival came before all else, the line between right and wrong blurred dangerously. Anna was left to endure it alone. Years passed. By 1868, Anna bore a child, a boy. His name never made it into the county's official records, though one census hints at his existence. A child listed with no clear parentage, living in Thomas's household. Some swore the boy looked more like a grandson than a son. Others avoided looking too closely at all. Anna was only 20 then, a young woman carrying the weight of a life she had not chosen. Her days were filled with work laundry by the creek, sewing by candlelight, tending to a baby whose eyes mirrored her own. To outsiders, she looked like any other struggling mother of the time. But those who knew her story could not forget the truth. She was both daughter and wife, bound to a father who had stolen her childhood and twisted her future. The story of Anna and Thomas is not the tale of one family alone. It speaks to the hidden tragedies of old America, where isolation, grief, and silence allowed forbidden bonds to take root. For Anna, it was a life lived under the shadow of secrecy, where love was poisoned by sin, and the people around her chose whispers over intervention. But the story does not end there. For as the years turned, as Anna's son grew, as neighbors grew bolder in their suspicions, the dark secret of the family would no longer stay hidden. And when the truth finally came to light, it would unravel everything. The years that followed were heavy with silence. Anna lived not as a child of God's grace, but as a shadow in her own home. The boy she bore grew fast, his laughter sometimes breaking the thick air that clung to that house. To the neighbors, he was simply Anna's child. Some thought perhaps she had been courted by a soldier passing through after the war, one of the many Union men who drifted across Kentucky with weary eyes and empty pockets. That was the easier story to believe, and most clung to it. But deep down, the valley knew. The truth never needed to be spoken. It lived in the glances people exchanged, in the way mothers pulled their daughters a little closer when Thomas passed, in the way church sermons on sin hung longer in the air when the family sat in the back pew. Everyone knew, but no one acted. That was how secrets lived in those times, not through denial, but through surrender. People convinced themselves that silence was safer than scandal. Anna bore this silence like chains. Each day she rose before dawn, swept the ashes from the hearth, cooked her father's breakfast, and cared for the child who called her Mama. In quiet moments, when the baby slept and the cicadas droned outside, she would stare at the walls and wonder what her life might have been if her mother had lived. She had once dreamed, like many girls her age, of a husband chosen from the town, of a home filled with laughter and neighbors who visited without fear. Instead, her life had shrunk to 4 wooden walls and the looming figure of her father. Thomas, for his part, grew stranger with time. The war had already carved bitterness into him, and the years after only deepened it. He no longer worked his fields with vigor. Instead, he spent hours staring into the hills, as if waiting for something that never came. Whiskey was his closest companion, and when it loosened his tongue, he often rambled about honor, about how the world had forgotten him, about how his daughter was the only one who truly understood him. In his broken mind, he had convinced himself that what bound them was love. But love built on such darkness is a curse, not a blessing. By 1871, Anna had borne a second child, a girl. The valley grew restless. 2 children without a husband's name was harder to excuse. Neighbors whispered louder now. One woman, a widow named Rebecca, who lived a mile down the road, once confronted Anna while they drew water from the same creek. Rebecca, her face stern but her eyes soft with pity, asked plainly, "Child, whose babies are those?" Anna froze. For a moment, it seemed she might speak, might finally open her mouth and let the truth pour out. But then her eyes fell, her voice barely a whisper. "They're mine. That's all." She turned away, her shoulders hunched, her secret retreating back into the silence that had kept her alive this long. Still, the whispers spread. By 1872, even the preacher could no longer ignore the uneasy air surrounding the family. One Sunday, his sermon thundered against sins of the flesh, sins within the home. His words cracked through the church like lightning, and though he never named names, every eye turned toward Anna and Thomas. Anna sat stiff, her hands clutching her daughter's bonnet. Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw set, as if daring anyone to speak against him. After that day, they stopped attending church altogether. The wooden pew where they once sat grew dusty, and their absence became its own kind of presence. In rural America of that time, church was the heartbeat of community. To step away from it was to step into exile. For Anna, it meant a deeper loneliness. For Thomas, it meant defiance. He no longer cared what others thought. He had chosen his path, and his pride chained him to it. The children grew under this shadow. The boy, now around 7, was strong and curious, often seen chasing chickens in the yard or carving sticks with a pocket knife. The girl, younger, clung to her mother's skirts, shy and wide-eyed. To them, Thomas was both grandfather and father, a confusing presence they never fully understood. They did not yet grasp the weight of their origins, but children are not blind. They felt the tension, the silence, the way their mother's eyes clouded when their grandfather entered the room. As time wore on, the burden grew too heavy for the valley to carry in whispers alone. Around 1875, a complaint reached the county sheriff. The details were thin, an anonymous letter, some say, written in a trembling hand by a neighbor who could no longer stomach the silence. It accused Thomas of acts unnatural against both God and law with his own flesh and blood. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man hardened by years of keeping order in a restless county, rode out to the house. He found Thomas splitting wood, sweat dripping down his brow. Anna was on the porch, her daughter in her lap, her son nearby with a slingshot. The sheriff asked questions softly at first, then firmer. He asked about the children, about the absence of a husband, about the talk in the valley. Anna's face turned pale. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Thomas, on the other hand, exploded. He shouted that it was nobody's business, that his family was his own, that the world had no right to judge what they did not understand. His voice thundered across the hills, and even the sheriff, who had faced gunmen and drunks aplenty, felt a chill at the fury in his eyes. The law in those days was not what it is now. Incest, though condemned by the Bible, was difficult to prosecute without confession or witnesses. The sheriff left that day without arresting Thomas. But the seed of scandal had sprouted, and it would not die easily. For Anna, that visit was both a terror and a small flicker of hope. Someone out there had spoken up. Someone had tried to break the silence. She spent nights after that staring at her children as they slept, wondering if perhaps escape was possible. But escape in 19th century America was no simple matter for a woman alone, bound to a father who watched her every move. She had no money, no allies, and no safe place to run. The world outside might free her from one chain, only to lock her in another dot by the late 1870s. The weight of their secret began to show. Thomas aged rapidly, his once strong body bent and tired. Whiskey stained his breath more often than not, and his temper grew wilder. Anna, though still young in years, carried herself like an old woman, her face lined by sorrow, her shoulders heavy with a burden no one should bear. Then came the breaking point. In 1879, tragedy struck again. The little girl, Anna's daughter, fell ill with fever. Despite every effort her mother's prayers, the bitter medicine mixed from herbs, the child withered. Within a week, she was gone. Anna buried her with trembling hands, her cries echoing through the valley. The grave was shallow, marked by a simple wooden cross dot at the funeral. Neighbors gathered in uneasy silence. Some came out of pity, some out of curiosity, but all felt the weight of judgment. A child's death was always a sorrow, but here it seemed like the hand of fate itself, punishing what had been kept in shadows for too long. Anna stood by the grave, her face hollow. Thomas stood beside her, his hand gripping her shoulder, as if to remind the world she still belonged to him. But for the first time, Anna felt something shift inside her. As the earth covered her child's body, she realized she could not let the rest of her life be buried under the same silence. The valley, too, had reached its limit. After the child's death, the whispers turned into open talk. People spoke at the tavern, at the general store, in the fields. "It ain't right," they said. "It ain't Christian. Someone has to stop it." And so the pressure grew both, inside Anna's heart and outside her home. The years of silence were ending. The family's darkest secret was no longer safe in the shadows. What came next would unravel everything: lives, reputations, and the fragile fabric of a community that had looked away for too long. The little grave on the hill haunted Anna's nights. When she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's face, fevered and fragile, slipping away, no matter how tightly she prayed or held her. She felt the small hand grow cold in her own, and every time she woke, gasping for breath in the darkness of that cabin, her father's heavy steps across the floor reminded her that she was not free. The child was gone, but the chains remained taut. It was during this season of grief that Anna began to change. Something in her broke, yes, but something else hardened. For years she had endured, silent and obedient, keeping her head low as her father's. Shadow towered over her life. But after burying her daughter, Anna's silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like a coffin. She knew that if she stayed quiet, she too would be buried long before her time. The valley folk sensed this change. When Anna walked into town, she carried herself differently. Her eyes, once always lowered, now looked straight ahead, sharp and steady. Her shoulders, though weary, no longer slumped beneath invisible weight. People whispered, not just about the scandal, but about her sudden steal. Some thought grief had driven her mad. Others thought God had touched her. Whatever it was, Anna had shifted, and the story was about to shift with her. The boy, her son, grew into a lanky child with a serious face. By the age of 10, he had begun to ask questions no child should ever have to ask. He wanted to know who his father was. Why did other children have grandfathers who looked different from their fathers, but his did not? Why did folks look at them strange when they walked into town? Anna had no answers she could bear to give. She only held him close, whispering, "You are mine. That is all that matters." But in her heart, she knew the truth would not stay buried forever. Thomas felt the ground shifting, too. He saw the looks in town, heard the murmurs grow bolder, noticed that people no longer lowered their eyes when he passed. The respect he once carried as a veteran, as a man of age, had eroded into disgust. His temper grew hotter. He lashed out at Anna, at the boy, at anyone who dared cross him. The whiskey never left his hand, and sometimes neighbors heard shouting from the house. Late into the night, the breaking point came in 1880, one sweltering July afternoon. A fight erupted between Thomas and Anna loud, violent, a kind of fight that echoed beyond the walls of their cabin. No one knew exactly what sparked it. Some say Thomas accused Anna of planning to leave. Others claim he struck the boy, and Anna finally rose to defend her son. Whatever the cause, the valley heard Anna's screams that day. Windows rattled, dogs barked, and neighbors paused in their fields, listening. By the next morning, the sheriff returned, this time not on a complaint, but at the urging of half the valley. He found Anna on the porch, her lips split, her dress torn at the shoulder. Thomas sat inside, drunk and mumbling, a pistol on the table beside him. The sheriff took one long look at Anna, then at the weapon, and for the first time he saw not just rumor but danger. This time Thomas was taken into custody, not for incest that was too tangled and unprovable, but for disorder, for threats, for the violence everyone now knew was spilling from his house. He was locked in the county jail, and for the first time in decades, Anna was alone. It should have been freedom. But freedom is not simple, and the world around you has already judged you. The valley turned its gaze on Anna, with Thomas behind bars. She was left standing in the open, her story no longer shielded by silence. Some pitied her, believing she had been a victim all along. Others condemned her, unable or unwilling to see how little choice she had been given. A few men, bold in their cruelty, whispered that she had been a temptress, that she had seduced her own father. The cruelty of gossip cut as deep as the cruelty of the home she had endured. Still, Anna did not retreat. For the first time she spoke, to the sheriff, to the preacher, to Rebecca the widow by the creek. She told pieces of the truth. Never the whole of it, never in detail, but enough. Enough for people to understand the shape of her suffering. Enough for them to see that she had been trapped, that her silence had been survival, not consent. The preacher, once reluctant, began to visit her. He urged her to repent, to pray for God's mercy, to cleanse herself of sin. But Anna's faith was no longer the preacher's faith. She prayed, yes, but her prayers were no longer for forgiveness. They were for strength, for escape, for the chance to give her son a life untainted by his grandfather's shadow. Meanwhile, Thomas waited in the county jail. For weeks he raged, demanding release, claiming injustice. He swore that his daughter was his lawful companion, that no one had the right to separate them. These rants disturbed even the hardened men who shared his cell. When he was finally brought before the county court, his madness was plain to all. The judge, a stern man with little patience, declared Thomas unfit, not just as a father, but as a man of sound mind. He was not imprisoned long-term laws then, had little room for such sins, but he was stripped of his home and sent under watch to a distant relative in another county. In truth, it was exile disguised as mercy. And so, for the first time, Anna was free of him. But freedom, after years, in chains, is a fragile thing. Anna and her boy remained in the valley, but life was far from simple. The land was no longer hers. The deeds had been in Thomas's name. She took work where she could, sewing for neighbors, cleaning houses, sometimes even teaching letters to the smaller children of the community. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but the past clung to her like a scar. People were kind to her face, yet she often heard the whispers when she walked away. The boy, too, bore the burden. By the time he reached his teens, he had begun to understand the truth. He heard the gossip, the cruel words spat by other children, the hints dropped by bitter adults. One day he came to Anna, his eyes hard with anger, and asked her outright, "Is it true? Is he my father?" Anna wept. She wept because the truth had finally broken the fragile wall she had built to protect him. She wept because she had no way to answer without breaking his heart. At last she told him, in words as simple as she could manage, that yes, his grandfather was also his father, that the life they had lived was not of her choosing, that she had been trapped and silenced. She begged him to see that he was innocent of it all, that none of the shame belonged to him. The boy did not speak for days. When he did, it was with a fire in his voice Anna had never heard before. He swore he would leave the valley, that he would make a name for himself beyond the hills, that he would not live under the shadow of his grandfather's sin. Anna feared for him, but she also admired the steel in his heart. Perhaps, she thought, he would be the one to finally break the curse. As the 1880s rolled on, Anna aged quickly. Her beauty, once remarked upon even in whispers, faded into a lined face and tired eyes. But there was something noble in her weariness, something that made people lower their voices when she passed. She had endured what no one should endure, and she had survived. That survival, in itself, carried a kind of power. Thomas, exiled and broken, faded from the story. Rumor said he died in 1886, drunk and alone, buried in a pauper's grave far from the valley he once ruled with his silence. Few mourned him. Some even said it was fitting that a man who had twisted the bond of family should die without family by his side. But Anna's story did not die with him. It lived on, not in records or headlines. No newspaper would dare print it, but in the whispered tales of the valley, in the cautionary stories mothers told their daughters, in the warnings fathers gave their sons. It lived on in the boy who carried the weight of two names, grandson and son, and who would one day leave those hills behind. And yet, for Anna, the past was not so easily buried. She carried it until her final days, a scar across her soul that no prayer could erase. When she lay dying in the spring of 1892, she asked only one thing of her son: "Do not let them forget me. Do not let them tell it wrong." Her son, it is said, kept that promise. He told her story not as a shame, but as a warning. He carried it into the next century, when the world had begun to change, when silence was no longer the only weapon people had. And so, even now, the story of Anna, the daughter who became a wife, the woman bound by a family's darkest secret, lingers. It lingers because it is not only her story. It is the story of countless women across the old American landscape, trapped by silence, crushed by grief, yet enduring, surviving, leaving behind whispers that still echo across time. After Thomas's death in the mid-1880s, the valley seemed to breathe easier. The man who had once commanded silence was gone, and with him the immediate threat of his temper, his shadow, his unholy bond. But the absence did not erase the story. If anything, it made it louder. People spoke of him more freely after the grave had claimed him. His name was spat out with disdain, whispered in warnings, turned into the kind of tale told by firelight when parents reminded their children that evil sometimes lived closest to home. For Anna, his death brought no joy, only an exhausted quiet. She lived on, working where she could, keeping her house small but neat, raising her son with the fierce devotion of a mother who had been denied so much. But even in freedom, she never fully escaped the prison her father had built around her. The valley still remembered, and memory can wound as sharply as a whip. Her son, his name was Samuel in some accounts, John in others, though records are scarce grew restless as he reached manhood. He had his mother's dark eyes and her quiet strength, but he carried something else too, a fire born of anger. He had grown up hearing the whispers, feeling the stares, knowing that his very existence was a living reminder of his grandfather's sin. By the time he turned 18, he told his mother plainly that he could not stay. "I cannot build a life here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not in the place where everyone knows what I am." Anna wept, but she did not stop him. She knew he was right. She had once dreamed of escape herself, in the darkest nights when her father's shadow loomed, but she had been bound too tightly. If her son could cut the chain, then perhaps her suffering had not been in vain, Dot. And so, in the spring of 1889, Samuel left the valley. He carried nothing but a small pack, a Bible his mother pressed into his hands, and the fierce determination not to be swallowed by the shame of his birth. He walked the dirt road out of Kentucky, and from there he made his way west. Like so many young men of that time who sought new beginnings, he worked on farms, on railroads, wherever he could earn a wage. His hands grew calloused, his shoulders strong. He spoke little of where he came from, and when asked about his family, he gave only vague answers. But in the quiet of his mind, he carried his mother's face, her sacrifice, her endurance. He carried the memory of the little grave on the hill, of the valley that had both judged and pitied them. And he carried a vow that he would not let the story die, but neither would he let it define him. Meanwhile, Anna's health declined. Years of hardship had worn her body thin, and though she was not yet old by the measure of time, she seemed older than her years. Her hair turned gray. Her hands stiffened. Her breath grew shorter with each winter. Neighbors, once distant, sometimes came to help her, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of guilt for their long silence. Rebecca, the widow by the creek, became her closest companion. They shared quiet evenings, mending clothes or simply sitting. On the porch, watching the hills darken with twilight. Dot, in those last years, Anna spoke more openly than she ever had. To Rebecca, she confessed the truth in fragments. How her father had blurred the lines after her mother's death, how she had borne children under his shadow, how silence had been both her shield and her curse. Rebecca listened, tears in her eyes, and told her she was not to blame, that her suffering was not her sin. But Anna was not so easily comforted. "I lived it," she would say softly. "No sermon can wash it away." When the spring of 1892 came, Anna's body finally gave. Out on her deathbed, her son returned to her side. He had traveled miles to see her, his hands rough from labor, his eyes older than his years. He knelt by her bed and held her frail hand. "Do not let them forget me," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "Do not let them tell it wrong," he promised. And with that promise, Anna closed her eyes for the last time. She was buried on the same hill as her daughter, beneath a simple wooden cross carved with her name. Some neighbors came to the burial, standing in silence, their faces heavy with sorrow and something else, perhaps regret. For years they had looked away, and now they stood before the grave of the woman they had failed to save. Samuel lingered by the grave long after the others had gone. He pressed his hand to the earth and swore he would carry her story forward, not as gossip, but as truth. And he did. Samuel built a life beyond the valley. He married, had children of his own, and worked hard to give them what he and his mother had never been given: stability, dignity, a name untainted by whispers. But he did not bury the past entirely. To his children, when they were old enough to understand, he told the story, not every detail, but enough. Enough for them to know the strength of the woman who had raised him. Enough for them to understand the weight of silence. Enough for them to see that even in the darkest of times, survival was its own kind of victory. As the years passed into the 20th century, Anna's story lived in fragments. Some told it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of isolation and silence. Others spoke of it as a tragedy, a wound in the history of the valley. For some, it became almost legend, a story whispered about the daughter who became a wife, her name softened by time, her face fading from memory. Yet beneath the whispers was a truth that cut deeper than scandal. Anna's story was not only about sin and shame. It was about endurance, about the cruel weight women often bore in old America, about the way silence can protect, can destroy in the same breath. It was about a mother who, despite everything, raised a son strong enough to walk beyond the valley and carry her memory into the world. Even now, more than a century later, her story lingers. It lingers in the old county records, where faint traces of her name can still be found. It lingers in the oral histories, passed quietly by families who swore they knew someone who knew her. And it lingers in the broader history of America itself, in the hidden lives of women whose suffering rarely made it into the books, but who shaped the fabric of our past in ways we cannot forget. Anna was, in the end, both victim and survivor. Her father had stolen her childhood, her freedom, her innocence, but he had not destroyed her spirit. She lived, she endured, she raised a son who carried her story, and in doing so, she broke the silence that had once bound her. And so, the tale of the daughter who became a wife, a family's darkest secret, is not only a tale of darkness. It is also a tale of light that refused to be extinguished, of memory that refused to be erased, of truth that survived long after those who lived it were gone. It is a reminder to all who look back on America's past that history is not only the wars and the leaders and the headlines. It is also the small cabins in the hills, the secrets behind closed doors, the voices of women like Anna, voices that whisper still if we are willing to listen.